We'll see you guys in about 30 minutes or so.
Okay. Have fun. And so we're missing Christina and Hayden. All right, we've got our 5-minute delay. So, all right, well, we will start. Let me be sure we are recording. Excuse me. Before we get into tonight's major section, I want to first remind you about Passover starting this coming Saturday night. And because it's Saturday night, the Kiddush includes with it the Havdalah. You'll see in the Haggadot, it has in it what you have to do for the Havdalah. We're going to practice some of the readings from that in a moment. But also, and something I neglected to talk about, is that the second night of Passover, we start what is called in Hebrew Sfirat HaOmer, the counting of the Omer. It says in the Torah, Svartem lachem mimocharat HaShabbat, you shall count for yourselves after the day after the Sabbath, 50 days. And the 50th day is the holiday of Shavuot. Now, the Torah itself is unclear when it says Mimocharat HaShabbat, the day after the Sabbath, what exactly is that a reference to? And so Jewish tradition understood that to mean the day after the Sabbath is a reference to the day after the first day of Passover. So we start counting the Omer from the day after the first day of Passover. In our case, it's outside the land of Israel. It's the night of the second Seder. Most Haggadot also have in the Haggadah the wording for that counting of the Omer. And we're supposed to count the Omer each night for the 50 days. Actually count it the 49th day. We don't count the 50th. And we have a bracha, a blessing, Shekid Mitzvotav V'Tzvana Al Sfirat HaOmer, the counting of the Omer. And then we recite what day of the Omer it is. And we also recite if it's a week. So it's tonight is the first night of the Omer, second night of the Omer, third night of the Omer, seventh night of the Omer, which is 1 week. Tonight is the 8th day of the Omer, which is 1 week and 1 day, et cetera, et cetera. And the tradition developed very clearly that we have to count the Omer, and we have to try and count it every night. If we miss a night, we have all day to catch up during the next day. If we don't count the Omer by the end of that day, then from then on, we're still supposed to count the Omer, but we do it without a blessing. And since we're supposed to be very careful about the counting of the Omer, we never say to somebody, if somebody says you what night of the Omer is tonight, you say yesterday we counted. We never say what tonight is when it is. So for example, if tonight were the first day of the Omer, we would say last night we didn't count the Omer. Tonight we'd start counting. Or if tonight's the 5th night of the Omer, we'd say last night was the 4th day of the Omer, till we get all the way through. Also, the Omer period, at some stage of history, it's unclear when exactly, became associated with a period of mourning. According to tradition, it commemorates the death of the students of Rabbi Akiva. And there are different customs that developed around it. Some some observe the period of time of the Omer as a kind of mourning period for the students of Rabbi Akiva. So no parties, no weddings are held. there are different customs as to how we count that. Some do the first 33 days of the Omer, and the 33rd day of the Omer is Lag BaOmer, which means the 33rd day of the Omer, after which we no longer have these mourning, which we'll talk about next week, actually, not in 2 weeks, excuse me. We'll talk about mourning practices, but includes haircuts and shaving the beard and all that sort of thing. So when we talk about Shavuot, we'll talk about it a little bit more as well. But starting the second night of the Omer, second night of Passover, we start counting the Omer. All right? My tradition is to hold the first 33 days, and then after Lag BaOmer do weddings. Now, in the conservative movement, there have been lots of different approaches towards counting of the Omer and how observant to be of counting the Omer. Different synagogues have different traditions on how they follow that. You can check with your rabbi again to see exactly how he or she says you should count the Omer. Okay, is that clear to everybody? And there are Omer counters, and I will send you one in the mail. I'll send you an email with it. Also, I sent an email earlier today with the revised schedule so that you know what we're doing to the end. It includes the section that we didn't make on the one-night quick history course. All right. So we will practice some Hebrew. So in order to do that, I need to, here it is. Share the screen. Oh, by the way, this is what the Omer counter will look like when I send it out to you. Monday means the night before, so there'll be Sunday night. We will start counting the Omer. Because the day begins with sunset, and so that's, according to the Hebrew calendar, that would be the day. I have to correct this a little bit to make it all ready for this year. Okay. Let's see this. Where is this? Oh, there we go. Okay. So these are some of the blessings that we will recite during the course of the evening on Passover and during the Seder. I want us to practice them together. This will be your Hebrew practice for tonight. So I ask you to unmute yourselves. It's a strange word to mute. Can
you just zoom in a bit?
Excuse me?
Can you make it a bit bigger?
Sure, I can. Sure, I can. Let's see. How's that?
Great.
Did that work?
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, I forgot. For me, it was fine. Okay, let's start with line number 1. All right, this shall be very easy for everybody. We say Baruch,
Baruch,
Atah,
Adonai,
Eloheinu,
Eloheinu,
Melech, Ha'olam, Borei, Hari, Hagafen. And that's for which? That's a blessing for what?
Kiddush.
For the wine.
The wine. And during the course of our Seder, we will say that bracha 4 times. By the way, that's one of the differences between the Ashkenazic Haggadah and the Sephardi Haggadah is we say the blessing every time we drink one of the 4 cups of wine. The Sephardim only say it the first time and the time that we have the cup of wine after Birkat HaMazon. All right, so let's go down now to line number 2. Okay, we have Baruch, Atah, Adonai, Eloheinu,
Elohim,
Melech,
Melech,
Ha'olam,
Ha'olam,
Borei,
Borei,
Me'orei,
Borei,
Ha'esh.
Ha'esh.
Anybody know what that's a blessing for?
for the candlelight at
For
Havdalah.
the Havdalah. Now, the way we do Havdalah on Yom Tov is we don't light a separate candle. Most people don't. What we do is the order will be at your Seder table the second night. You have the Kiddush, and then as part of the Kiddush, you will have the Havdalah. The candles for Yom Tov should already be lit. So what we do is we use the light of those candles for the Havdalah. We look at those candles, look at our fingernails and the light of those candles to fulfill the mitzvah of saying the blessing for Havdalah. Okay, let's look at line number 3. We have Baruch,
Baruch,
Atah,
Atah,
Adonai,
Adonai,
Eloheinu,
Eloheinu,
Melech,
Melech,
got to know this by now,
Ha'olam,
Olam,
Olam.
Shehakol,
no,
No.
you're
Oh,
guessing, no guess,
Shehecheyanu,
Shehecheyanu, Shehecheyanu,
Shehanu,
Vikimanu,
Vikimanu,
Vihigianu,
Vihianu,
Lazman,
Lazman,
Hazeh.
Hazeh.
Okay, that's the Shehecheyanu. You say that when we light the candles, and also during the Kiddush, if you haven't said Shehecheyanu yet. Okay, line number 4, we have again.
Baruch,
Yeah, let me hear you guys. Baruch,
Baruch,
Atah,
no,
Adonai,
yep,
Eloheinu.
Adonai,
Melech Haolam,
Adonai, Eloheinu,
Melech,
Melech,
Olam,
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 Borei,
Uri,
Ri,
Adama,
Adama, Adama.
that's for fruits and that's veggies, right?
Is fruit of the earth. That's what we say when we eat the karpas, whatever after the green vegetable to dip in the salt water. Okay. Normally during a meal, we would say the hamotzi, and then we would say that it covers everything in the meal. But because of the nature of the Passover Seder, we have something first, and so therefore we say a bracha before we eat that. Okay, line number 5. Ma, Ishtana,
Ishtana,
Alayla,
Alila,
Hazeh,
Hazeh,
Mikol,
Mikol,
Mibo,
Halelot.
Halilot,
6. Shebechol,
Shebechol,
Halelot,
Laila,
Halilot,
Anu.
Anu,
Try it this way. Ochlim,
Ochlim,
Queen,
Hametz,
Hametz,
Umatzah,
Matzah.
Umatzah.
Laila,
Laila.
Hazer,
Azer.
Kulo,
Kulo.
Matzah.
Matzah.
Okay. Line 7, we have Shebechol, Halelot,
Alelot.
Anu,
Anu.
Ochlin,
Ochlin.
Sha'ar,
Sha'ar.
Yirakot,
Yirakot.
Halayla,
Alayla.
Hazeh,
Azer.
Maror.
Maror.
All right. Line number 8, Shebechol,
Shebechol.
Halelot,
Alelot.
Ein,
Ein.
Anu,
Anu.
Matbilin,
Matbilin.
Afilu,
Afilu.
Pa'am, Echat,
Echat.
Halayla,
Alayla.
Hazeh,
Azer.
Shetei,
Shetei.
Ve'amim.
Ve'amim.
Okay, line number 9, Shebechol,
Shebechol.
Halelot,
Alelot.
Anu,
Anu.
Ochlin,
Ochlin.
Bain,
Bain.
Yoshvin,
Yoshei.
Uvain,
Uvain.
Misubin,
Mesubin.
Halayla,
Alayla.
Hazeh,
Azer.
Kulanu, Misubin.
Misubin.
All right, so those are the 4 questions. All right, why do we need, all other nights we eat matzah, chametz or matzah. Tonight it's only matzah. All other nights we eat all kinds of vegetables. Halal, hazeh, this night it's bitter vegetables, bitter herbs. On all other nights, we don't dip even 1 time. Tonight we dip 2 times. And all other nights, we eat whether we're sitting up or we're reclining. This night, we all recline. Okay? So those are the 4 questions that the Seder answers during the course of the evening. Ready. Stop share. Okay. All right, so tonight we are continuing with the life cycle and the rituals that go along with it. And obviously one of the most important and valuable things in Jewish tradition is to get married, have a family. That is a very important Jewish tradition. And it goes back to the biblical account that God says to Adam and Eve, Adam and Chava, be fruitful and multiply. And so our tradition teaches that there is a desire that everyone should marry, that everyone should have offspring. We are meant to replenish the world, have people in the world. Certainly Judaism, as in many religions, saw this as being a positive element of life. You know, one of the differences, we may have touched upon it before, between Judaism and Christianity is that for Judaism, this is not, you know, you got to do, you know, what can I tell you? It's, you know, the only way to be fruitful and multiply is have sex. If you avoid it, according to Paul, you skip it altogether. Catholic Church, the idea of celibacy is certainly something that was important and still is important to the church. For Judaism, that is something contrary to the Jewish ideal. The ideal is for marriage. The ideal is to have children. The ideal is to enjoy the relationship of a husband and wife in the marital state. All of these are considered to be goods and beneficial goods in aspects of life. And indeed, we'll see in a minute that one of the aspects of what a husband promises his wife in the traditional Ketubah is to provide for her sexual needs. It's interesting, the rabbis say that the mitzvah, Peru, be fruitful and multiply, is incumbent upon the man and not the woman. Because the woman, when she gets pregnant, especially in the ancient world and still today, endangers her life to a certain degree. And so the rabbis said that women were not obligated, at least according to most rabbinic opinions, in that mitzvah. And that opens the door. Did we talk about birth control in Jewish attitudes towards it? No, we didn't. Okay. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. So that figures in that understanding of the birth control, as well as the understanding of abortion and when abortions are permitted and when they are not permitted. Right? So in the ancient world, rarely did two people go to the local singles bar and meet up and get married. Although, if you remember, we talked about how Jacob met his wife at the well. Abraham's servant, who was sent to find a wife for Isaac, met Rebekah at the well. Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, when he went to Midian, he met his wife at the well. So I guess the local well was the local singles bar in those days. But we know up until modern times, really, marriage was often not romantic in the sense of, two people just finding each other. No Romeo and Juliet kind of thing. Marriages were arranged. People got together and said, well, your son and my daughter will make a good match, or a matchmaker would say they would make a good match, or there were business dealings, or countries that had kings and queens and needed to make alliances. All of those were part and parcel of marriage in the ancient world. And marriage also was a business agreement. There are certain aspects of marriage that have, at least traditionally, been associated with obligations and responsibilities, husband and wife, to property that was brought into a marriage. All of that was part and parcel of the ancient Jewish approach towards marriage. So that we have, even till today, the tradition is that there is a marriage document called the Ketubah. And the Ketubah, as I'll read to you a little bit later, essentially guarantees the wife's status in the terms of that marriage. And God forbid anything happens to the husband or happens to the marriage. Okay, so that's the first thing to remember. Now, certainly today, marriages are not necessarily arranged. People find the other person that they're interested in all kinds of manners today, whether it be introduction by friends, if it's somebody you meet at work, somebody you meet on a social occasion, or today, I know when I was still in the active rabbinate and had a number of weddings, people had often met on one of the dating apps. And there are several Jewish ones out there that are designed for people who want to find a Jewish spouse. And just like any of the other apps that are out there, you know, you take your chances or whatever the case may be if you use it. All right. But let's say, regardless of how the couple gets together, they at some point in time will decide they want to get married. And the Jewish marriage contains certain elements, and we're going to go over those elements. Right? First and foremost is that ideally a man and a woman live together as husband and wife. That is the ideal in Jewish tradition. And the marriage is really created not by rabbis, but is really created by the man giving something of value to the woman and the two of them agreeing to create that marriage. That's essentially what it is. So the easiest way to go over it is to explain what happens in terms of the marriage ceremony. First of all, get engaged. Mazel tov, mazel tov. When are you going to get married? Isn't it about time? You know, whatever people are going to say. And so the idea of an engagement party really is a traditional Jewish concept. It's usually called a l'chaim because you drink a l'chaim to the bride and groom, and you invite everybody over, and the two sides of the family get to look at the other side of the family and, oh, yeah, you made a mistake here, or yeah, you're nice people, or whatever the case is. All right. So you've got to pick a date. There are certain times on the calendar when traditionally marriages don't take place. So consult your rabbi before you pick a date. As a matter of fact, find a rabbi first. I've had a number, it's happened many a times. I get a call, we've got everything else arranged, but we didn't arrange for a rabbi, and this rabbi can't make it, and that rabbi can't make it. Are you available? Okay, so I triple my price when I hear, no. All right. But it's important to speak with a rabbi to make sure that everything is on track that you need. So you're going to have a place where you're going to get married. It doesn't have to be anything fancy. It can be the backyard, your living room, whatever. I'm just, you know, and ideally it should be a kosher ceremony and a kosher meal that's with it. In Jewish tradition, all of our rituals, all of our ceremonies are contain along with them the idea of a celebratory meal, in which is really in many ways part and parcel of the wedding ceremony itself, as I'll explain later. All right. So you've picked a date, you've got the rabbi lined up, you've decided what you're going to do for the food and everything in that department. So now, of course, you have to have a ring. Jewish tradition prescribes that there are three ways to contract a marriage: shtar, kesef, ubia. One can marry through a document. One can marry through the transference of money or monetary value. Or one can actually create a marital bond by having sexual relations for the purpose of being married. Mm-hmm. The rabbis frowned on the last one. But in theory, if you have two witnesses outside the door of your apartment, where you're together as husband and wife together, that can constitute technically a Jewish marriage. It's not fully done, but it creates what we call the erusin, the betrothal. Okay? So today, what normally transpires is that under the chuppah, we do everything together at one time under the chuppah. The groom will give the bride a ring. Traditionally, it's a plain band usually today gold or whatever material. The rabbi said it had to be, the value of it has to be easily ascertainable to work in this manner. In other words, that's why traditionally we don't allow stones in the marriage ring itself. It's usually just a plain gold band. If you want to have a fancier ring for a wedding ring, what is often done is there's somebody in the family who has a plain gold band, and the groom has to purchase it and then give it to the bride under the chuppah. And if the bride chooses to give it back to somebody or to sell it back to somebody or whatever, they can do so. All right, so now we're getting ready for the big nuptials. So there is a tradition that the Shabbat, usually Shabbat before, the wedding takes place. It was originally that the groom would be called to the Torah for an aliyah, and there would be a special blessing said for the bride and the groom. Different synagogues today have different ways they handle it. That's, again, one of the reasons why talking to a rabbi, if you're going to have it, it's called in Yiddish an ufruf. In Hebrew, they're referred to as Shabbat Chatan, traditionally. And in the Ashkenazic tradition, this takes place on usually the Shabbat immediately prior to the wedding. Doesn't have to be the immediate Shabbat before, but it is often done. You know, again, you talk to your rabbi. In Sephardic circles, they actually do it the Shabbat immediately after the wedding. So it works in different ways. Okay, so now you've made arrangements, however that's going to be handled for the if that's what you choose to have. It's not absolutely necessary. Now, if you chose a normal day of the week, an ordinary day on the calendar, there is a tradition for the bride and groom to fast the day of their wedding. Again, it's not obligatory, it's a tradition. And, but the idea being that this is a very important important milestone in someone's life. And it's marked in being seen as in some ways like a Yom Kippur Katan, a Yom Kippur for bride and groom, that their sins are forgiven on that day of their wedding. And there's a special connection said to be between the bride and groom and the Kadosh Baruch Hu, the Holy One, praise be He. And so that's why there's a tradition at because usually weddings are late afternoon or evening. At the mincha service, if one attends, the groom and or the bride recite the same confessional that we recite on Yom Kippur, because the idea that is how much a change in their status in their life is going to be. If it's a Rosh Chodesh or other days, there are certain times that the bride and groom don't fast. When I speak to a bride and groom, I usually say it's usually the groom, has a hard time fasting, and the bride's usually so nervous, and the brides don't usually seem to be having much trouble fasting. But if, by the way, if it interferes in some way, you can have, you can break the fast right away. No question about that. And part of the tradition in a traditional wedding ceremony, when we get to it, there's something to eat for the bride and groom immediately following the ceremony. Okay, so now we've reached the big day. Bride and groom have either fasted, not fasted, whatever the case may be. Everybody's, have to march in. You don't have to. The only thing that's important is that the bride and groom are together under the chuppah. The chuppah is the wedding canopy that Jewish tradition says is where the wedding takes place. And it's said to represent the future home of the bride and groom, open on all sides as a symbol of welcoming of guests and people to come into. Now, if you do march down, there is no way it has to be done. The standard way that it is done, that doesn't mean it has to be this way, but the way most weddings are, you have the the elderly relatives who want to be able to participate but don't want to stand up under the chuppah, or you don't want them standing under the chuppah, they come in first. Then you have the groomsmen, and then the groom's parents, the chatan's parents, walk halfway down the aisle. The groom walks in. They then escort him to under the chuppah. In many Orthodox weddings, the groom will put on a kittel, just like on Yom Kippur, the white coat, which is also the garb that we wear at death. Okay. So then comes the bride's turn. You have bridesmaids, you have flower girls, whatever the case may be. Again, the bride's parents walk down the aisle halfway. The bride comes in. They escort the bride to the foot of the chuppah, or up to the chuppah, to where the groom is. Now, a major Ashkenazic tradition is that the bride circles the groom 3 or 7 times, right, for the ceremony. Again, you talk to your rabbi about what is going, how that is to be handled. Okay, I made a mistake. I skipped something. I've done that on occasion. Before we get to all of this, there are a few things, there's some paperwork that has to be handled. First of all, you have to have a license from the province of Ontario if you're getting married in Ontario. And that you have to arrange by going to the city halls, or various ones you can go to. And I think they're good for 3 months. And your rabbi, of course, will talk to you about that as well. Now, there is also a Ketubah. The Ketubah is a traditional Jewish wedding document. And the Ketubah has its origins in rabbinic tradition. The reason for the Ketubah really goes to the fact that traditionally the marriage, is not really completely equal. We read in the Torah that if a man finds something untoward in his wife, Ervat Davar, he can write her a bill of divorce and send her away. That's what, and so the rabbis understood that to mean that only the groom, only the husband has power of divorce. We will talk about that more a little bit later this evening when we talk about divorce in Jewish law. But in order to protect the wife, the rabbis instituted what is called the Ketubah. Ketubah is a document. In it, it's written traditionally in Aramaic, and traditionally it basically says that the groom, in the presence of witnesses on a certain day of the week, certain time of the month, etc., says to the bride, be my wife in accordance with the law of Moses and Israel, and I will cherish, honor, support, and maintain you in accordance with the custom of Jewish husbands who cherish, honor, support, and maintain their wives in truth. And I herewith make for you a settlement of 200 zuzim. How much a zuz is worth today is a good question. The document says that the status of the bride, again, this is an ancient thing and it's not a very modern concept. A first bride, unmarried woman, is given a ketubah of a total of 200 zuzim. Well, she's been married before, divorced, widowed, what have you. It was traditionally only 100 zuzim. Now, the groom can add what he wants to it. He can put much more in that if he chooses. And in Israel, especially in Sephardic circles, they put real money into the ketubah. You hear a ketubah of $1 million. Here today in our world, this is purely ceremonial, because obviously, God forbid anything happens to the marriage, that's decided by civil courts in accordance with civil law. But as I say, when we get to the get, it still is part and parcel of Jewish tradition. So what happens? So the groom promises a certain sum of money to the bride. And also he promises that he will provide for her food, clothing, and necessaries, stark, and all of those things that are obligatory to a man to give to his wife. And he promises to provide for a marriage settlement, God forbid. And he also promises to take responsibility of any property that the bride brings into the marriage. And he mortgages, he has a lien against all of his property, anything and everything that he owns, up to the shirt off of his back, the glima al katafai, to cover whatever the bride brings into the marriage. And if she should, if the marriage is dissolved, she will recuperate all those sums. And the bride, by accepting this ketubah, takes upon herself to live in accordance with her husband, according to Jewish tradition. Now, traditionally, this document, as I said, was in Aramaic. It was witnessed by two witnesses. Traditionally, they were male, Shomer Shabbat, they'd be Sabbath observant. Again, you talk to your rabbi when the time comes, what he or she says has to be there. So traditionally, the ketubah is signed before the wedding. All right. If you go to an Orthodox wedding, they often have the men in one room and the women in another. They sign the ketubah, and then they bring it to where the bride is. If there's going to be a signature of the bride on it, again, you talk to the rabbi. Depending upon how it is staged, in Orthodox circles, they also will have what is called a Tanoim. They sign documents, pre-marriage documents. We won't go into that. You talk to your rabbi if they have anything that they insist upon. If the bride is there for this part, because a lot of conservative rabbis, we just do it in our study or in a room all together. The second thing that takes place there after the signing of the marriage license and the witnessing of the ketubah is what is called in Yiddish the bedeken. The groom will place a veil over the bride. Traditionally, brides are veiled for the wedding ceremony. According to Maimonides, that is an absolute necessity. And then they have the part about marching in. Okay, so we've now went back, we're marched in, we're under the chuppah. The groom the bride is traditionally to the right of the groom. Right? And usually, not always, but usually the bride and groom stand so that their back is to the congregation. And they're facing towards the rabbi with the back towards the congregation. It is sometimes done the other way. It depends on you and what your desires and again, what you work out with your rabbi. Then traditionally there are 2 cups of wine under the chuppah. Some rabbis use only one. I, for example, and many of my colleagues insist upon 2 wine glasses that are there. And then the rabbi who's Mesader Kiddushin, who is the one who's performing this ceremony, takes the first cup of wine, says a Borei Pri Agafen, the blessing over wine. And then he recites what is called Birchat Erusin, the betrothal blessing. Which essentially said, praise God, the King of the universe, sanctifies his commandments, command is concerning forbidden relations and forbidden us, those who were merely betrothed, allow us to lawfully married, et cetera, et cetera. So there's an idea here that this creates the marital bond that permits a man and a woman eventually for a husband and wife together. Then traditionally, the groom takes a sip of the wine. The bride's veil is lifted up so that she can take a sip of the wine, and then the veil is lowered back down. Usually what then happens is the ketubah is read. Excuse me, before that, I keep going out of line. I did this once at a wedding too and got in trouble. Now the groom turns to the bride, and she holds out her right index finger, traditionally. And before the groom puts the ring on the bride's finger, he says, Harei at mikudeshet li b'dabat zo kadat Moshe v'Yisrael. Behold, you're consecrated to me by this ring, in accordance with the law of Moses and people of Israel. Again, traditionally, you have two witnesses who witness the giving of the ring. They will also be asked to ascertain that it's worth at least a pruta, which means it's got to be worth at least a few pennies, and that the groom gives the bride the ring. Now, in traditional weddings, there was no giving of the ring from the bride to the groom. Most of my colleagues will permit it, but they usually have it after the reading of the Ketubah to serve as a separation. So usually, again, what happens? The Ketubah is read. The groom then gives the bride the Ketubah. She hands it over to somebody for safekeeping. If the rabbi is going to make remarks, he often makes remarks then. Some rabbis make it at the beginning, some at the end. It varies depending upon the rabbi. And then if the bride is going to give the groom a ring, then they will face each other usually, and the bride will give the ring to the groom. Those of us who follow tradition more strictly will have the bride say, Ani l'dodi v'dodi li, I'm my beloved's and my beloved is mine. It's not the same language of erusin, of betrothal, because the betrothal has already been created by the groom giving the ring to the bride and the bride accepting the ring. So now, originally, all of this ceremony took place many months before the conclusion. And at some stage of history, the two parts of the marriage ceremony were brought together, as we do today. So the second part is called the kiddushin, or chuppah, excuse me, chuppah. Basically what this entails is we take a second cup of wine and we recite 7 blessings, the Sheva Brachot, the 7 wedding blessings that essentially relate what is transpiring. Again, there's always, with all of these, we have Borei Pri Hagafen, the blessing over the wine. And then the Sheva Brachot, praise God for the fruit of the vine, praise God who creates everything for his glory, who's created human beings, who is in the divine image, who gladdens Israel, Zion, through restoring our children, gladden the bride, groom and bride, and then praising God, who helps means together the bride and groom for rejoicing and celebrating. And so soon may it be heard in the streets of Jerusalem, sound of bride and groom, people rejoicing at the chuppah. Once again, the bride and groom drink from the wine. This time the bride's veil is traditionally, in most cases, put back out of the way, so it's out of the way altogether. The last step is the breaking of a glass. This is based upon a Talmudic tradition that essentially is saying that even in our times of joy, we have to be aware of sadness in the world, represented by the destruction of the ancient temple. And so traditionally, something is broken, a glass. Some people will have a glass for that. Some will take a light bulb wrapped up, and the groom, using his right foot, stamps on the glass. And then everybody yells out Mazel Tov. It really shouldn't be at that point, but that's what everybody does because that's really remembrance of the destruction of the temple, but that's what people do. Following the ceremony, the bride and groom are supposed to retreat to a room where they are clearly alone together for a period of time with witnesses outside the door to symbolize that they are now husband and wife. Traditionally, married men, and unmarried women did not segregate together by themselves. It was just not done in the ancient Jewish world, still not done in very Orthodox circles. that a woman will not be alone with a man who's not her husband. So this is a sign of that. And by eating together, having something to eat, breaking the fast, this also symbolizes the home and that you're creating a marital life together. Now, the Sheva Brachot, the 7 wedding blessings, are actually can be recited at any time there's a meal. They certainly are recited at the wedding meal after the Birkat HaMazon. And then anytime during the next week, the 7 days, if there's somebody who has not been around before for the Sheva Brachot, and there's a minyan, the tradition is that we can recite the Sheva Brachot again as part of the grace after meals, the Birkat HaMazon. Now, it's because in part that in Jewish tradition, it developed early on, that any kind of blood that was visible in the female organ was regarded as menstrual blood. So assuming there was a virgin marriage, virgin bride, that was the first time they had sexual relations, and normally there would be blood, and we're not going to go into all of that. In the ancient world, that was very important. But it became regarded by the rabbinic tradition to be just like a woman had her menses. And so the husband and wife, after that first encounter, would not have sexual relations for at least a week and a half, because of, as we do with menses. All right. And so there was no such thing as a honeymoon going off somewhere. But, and again, this is found in many traditional circles. People are invited. They invite the bride and groom to their homes for a festive meal, where the Sheva Brachot are recited, all these kinds of things that transpire during that time. Yeah. Now, there are other things that can be done and can be part of the marriage ceremonies and things that, again, you talk to your rabbi, you talk to the rabbi what kind of ketubah you're going to have. It's going to be the traditional ketubah. Some permit different other kinds of ketubah out there. Again, you have to consult with your rabbi as to the nature of the ketubah. You can have cheap ones. I do mine. Sometimes I do it right off my computer for people for a simple wedding. Or you can pay a lot of money to have a very fancy ketubah made, even a scribal one made for just your wedding, and etc. Okay. So that's essentially what transpires in terms of the wedding ceremony, getting ready, all those kinds of things. All right. Now, as I mentioned, the Torah in Deuteronomy speaks to the possibility of divorce. And the language used in the Torah is if a man sees something as ervat davar, some unseemly matter. And the school of Shammai, and this was taken up in certain Christian circles, understood that to mean that he did not have proof. He was suspicious that his wife was fooling around on him, and therefore he didn't want to be married to her any longer. However, the school of Hillel was much more lenient. And a famous saying of Rabbi Akiva was that if she burnt his dinner, that was grounds for divorce, or could be used. Okay. And the simplest explanation for that is if marriage has gotten to that state where a burnt dinner is that cataclysmic, then the marriage has broken down. And Jewish tradition was never very big on having a divorce, although it's certainly part and parcel of our tradition. Furthermore, in the ancient world especially, a woman was never completely safe and secure on her own as an independent person. That was just the reality of the ancient world. And she was either protected by being the daughter, her father took care of her, watched over her, looked out for her needs, or she was a wife. A single woman was at a very marked disadvantage. And we can see that also because the Torah oftentimes when it talks about our need to support the people in society who need help, we talk about the orphan, the widow, and the stranger. Because those were considered to be the people most at danger in ancient society. So on the one hand, we have this idea that if a man is unhappy with his wife, he can give her a get. That's what's called in Hebrew, a bill of divorce. And she's out of luck. So the rabbis early on instituted what I call as a ketubah. That's what we talked about, the signing of ketubah before the wedding ceremony. And in that ketubah was the protection that a woman had. And that's why the monies involved with it were very important. That's why the rabbi said a man and woman shouldn't live together as husband and wife without a written ketubah. And when you go through the Talmud and talking about divorce and things like that, the ketubah becomes extremely important inheritance issues and all kinds of things in the ancient world. Like I say, today, the ketubah and the get are pro forma, but they're very important for Jewish tradition. And a man and a woman who are married Jewishly, traditionally cannot get married again if there was not a get issued. There was not a Jewish divorce. Now, we do know also, and we read about it in the Torah and see it in other books of the Bible, that polygamy was practiced in ancient Israel. A man could have more than one wife. That's why adultery was defined by the status of the woman in the ancient world. If a married woman had sexual relations with someone other than her husband, that was the definition of adultery. Because a man could only commit adultery if he was having relations with somebody else's wife. If he took another woman, she could be another wife for him. So in the ancient world, that was not considered to be adultery. Might not be proper behavior if he wasn't marrying her, but nonetheless, it wasn't considered to be adultery in that sense, technical term. So the rabbis create the ketubah. They say a man can divorce his wife if he wants to, but then they make it very difficult for him. For example, we know in Alexandria around the year 1000, give or take, there was a special codicil written into the Ketubot that a man could not take a second wife or even hire a female servant without the permission of his wife. And if he chose to do so, there was a very heavy fine that he had to pay her. And a substantial fine. There were wealthy men who may have more than one wife. But around the same time that this was developing in Africa, North Africa, in which the Jews were living amongst Muslims, and Muslims had the practice of having polygamy. The Jews in Europe were living amongst Christians who did not practice polygamy. And so around the year 1000, a little bit before then, there was a famous takana of Rabbeinu Gershom. Rabbi Gershom was one of the most outstanding figures of that period of history in Europe amongst the Jews. And he was credited with issuing a number of takanot. And these takanot, and many of them were for the protection of a woman. First of all, they ruled that a man could not take a second wife. They made a special exception to that. If there 100 rabbis agreed to it, and it was for special circumstances, he could do so. Let's say the woman became incompetent and he needs somebody to care for his children and his family. All right, that's one. Another thing is the rabbi said a man could not divorce his wife against her will. and a number of other items as well. So these protections were there to protect the wife, but what they could not do was to give the wife the power of divorce. The understanding was that this was a biblical law. You cannot override such a biblical law. You could put fences around it. You could protect the man. You can stop the man from divorcing his wife, but you could not change it so that she could divorce him. Don't let me forget, before the end of the evening, I'll talk about special circumstances in today's world. Okay. So let us say the reality is a husband and wife, things happen. We pray to God they don't happen in a marriage, but they do sometimes. And it is better to go live apart, be apart, start life over again. Now, as I said, rabbinic tradition was very hesitant in this area. They wanted shalom bayit, peace at home. And sometimes my Orthodox colleagues, even today, overdo it in that department. I'll give you an example. Many years ago, a friend of my wife and I was visiting with us. We knew her for many, many years. When we were in Texas, at a shul in Texas, she and her husband unfortunately got divorced. She was staying with us for several months, and a get was issued for her from her husband. It was an Orthodox get, and duly witnessed by the Orthodox rabbis in the area. But he was in El Paso, and she was in Toronto. And so the get had to be delivered to her through agency. And so they went before the local Beit Din, Orthodox Beit Din. I appeared as a witness to who she was and et cetera. And they tried at that point to see if they could say, maybe you don't need to have a get, you don't need to have a divorce, which is a little ridiculous. They've been away from each other for a long time. They're different countries at the time, but they had to put their nose in it that way. Right? But that's how stringent the idea is to try and avoid a divorce. But if indeed this is what it comes to, what happens traditionally is only a few scribes are around who write a get. It's a complicated procedure. What usually transpires is in front of a Beit Din, the husband appoints a scribe to write a get for his wife, and it has to be only for his wife. It can't be a fill-in-the-blank get. And they make sure to know all the names that both parties are known by. For example, my get, if God forbid, if after almost 50 years, it's too late to give a get to my wife. But anyway, if I were to give her a get, God forbid, it would be identified as the Rav Menachem Yosef ben Ze'ev Berman. That's my Hebrew name, with a titled rabbi. Also known in English as Martin Jeffrey Berman. Also known as Marty Berman. Any kind of nickname and thing that I would be known by. Similarly, my wife would have any and all kinds of identification names written into the get. The place and time of the get is identified, what city it's in, what river it is near. The scribe is empowered to write even up to 100 gittin, 100 gets, until this one comes out the way it should be. And so the groom gives, he's already gotten it from the scribe to start with, he gives him the special paper and pen and ink and everything for him to go write it. And then you have to wait around until the get is written properly. Everything has to be spelled properly, no mistakes are allowed in it. It's very technical. So then the get is presented in front of the witnesses, and this is who's ever conducting this get. and they check it out and make sure that this is the get that was written for on behalf of this man and this woman. And the husband has to acknowledge that this is the get that he did empower this scribe to write. It's then folded up, and the groom has to drop it into the hands of the wife or her agent, who's there to collect it for her, who then takes 4 steps, turns around, comes back. Again, the get is looked at, examined to make sure that this is the same one that's been there the whole time. And then traditionally what happens is the get is cut. Razor blade cuts in it, so it cannot be used again. And the the husband and wife are issued what is called a patur, a document saying that this get was duly given on a such and such a date, and in 3 months' time they can marry somebody else. Okay, the 3-month time is really make sure that the woman's not pregnant. It goes back to the ancient world that in 3 months a woman generally showed, even today, and without being able to check paternity and all of that, it was the issue when to make sure. Okay, and so that get is left with that court, and I keep a file of it. And if you ever need to be, I had to deal with a case one time. I had to check up on a get. It was a crazy case, but anyway, it was a crazy woman who wanted to challenge the get, and she's crazy for wanting to challenge it because here's the issue. Now, I said before that only the husband has power of divorce in Jewish tradition. That still holds true in the conservative movement and in the Orthodox world. The Reform and Reconstruction, others may do different things. However, we do know that the following is found in the Talmud, that if a man issues a get for his wife and he sends it to her by an agent to deliver to her, and the agent, the shliach, walks out the door, and the guy has second thoughts. He could, in theory, cancel the get, and the get would be no good. The problem is, it gets to the woman. Let's say she's in Rome, he's in Jerusalem. It takes a few months to get there. Takes time for it to transpire. She thinks she's divorced. She remarries on the basis of that get. And then comes, lo and behold, the husband gets in touch with her and says, sorry, you're not divorced. I didn't divorce you. All your children are mamzerim. They're bastards, any children you have from this man. So the rabbi said, if a man does such a thing, gives a get to an agent, and the agent leaves, and then the husband nullifies the get, the rabbis say that the marriage is null and void from the very beginning. They use the power, what they call hefker, beit din, hefker. That the beit din, the court, the rabbinic court, has the power to declare property ownerless. So they say that ring that man gave to that woman all those years ago when they got married, we declare after the fact that it did not belong to him. Since it did not belong to him, he didn't give her anything. Since he didn't give her anything from him, there was never a marriage. That's called hafka'at kiddushin. The rabbis felt that they had the authority to do that under special circumstances. And we know that authority existed. It was not really used, but it was there. So in the conservative movement, and there have been some Orthodox rabbis who've also suggested the same thing, do permit under certain circumstances to use hafka'at kiddushin to uproot kiddushin. Now, it's not a divorce, and that's why there's complications, why the Orthodox are very uncertain about it, and it means that when a man and a woman together for all those years, at least according to traditional Jewish understanding of it, they were having sexual relations outside the bounds of marriage. And the children are not mamzerim if they have children, but they're not, quote, legitimate to the husband. It doesn't really change anything to the most part, but that's it. So it's not a very nice thing to have to go through. But if the husband refuses to give a get, and there's no way they can force him to do it, that can transpire. Now, in the state of Israel, land of Israel, the rabbinic courts have power over marriage and divorce. And the rabbinic courts can turn to the secular courts and say, Chaim Yankel refuses to give his wife a get, leaving her an aguna, a chained woman. We insist that she deserves to be given a get. He's recalcitrant, and we ordered him to give a get of his own free will, and he refuses. So therefore, the civil courts can say, all right, you have to listen to the rabbis and give him a get, give a get to your wife. And if you don't, we're going to throw you in jail until you decide to give your wife a get. And that's happened, not too often, but it's happened. And sometimes a guy such a mamzer, SOB, whatever language you want to use, he'd rather be in prison than give his wife a get. Now, for those of you who are old enough to have seen the very first, that's Sanchino, what's, oh. It was on the top of my head, the mobster series. Oh, don't worry about it. Anyway, the Rambam Maimonides, and based upon the Talmud, says that if a man is ordered by the court to give his wife a get, the court can give him lashes until he says, I want to give my wife a divorce of my own free will. All right? The rabbi said, everybody wants to do what's right. Sometimes your yetzer hara, your evil urge, gets in the way. And so if we can beat down the yetzer hara, the evil urge, then you'll do the right thing, and then for it's by your own free will. And we know that in different communities in different periods of time, that's taken place. That the courts have insisted the man give his wife a get. He doesn't want to, and they find some way to pressure him. There were Jewish communities, and still happens today, where the husband refuses, and the wives in that community, the Orthodox community, they're all connected with each other. The wives say, we're not going to go to the mikveh until he gives his wife a divorce, a get. So the husbands, who now have no outlet for their sexual relations with their wives, they give him a little, don't you think you ought to give your wife a get? Until they finally convince him somehow to do so. I was thinking about was on the very first Sopranos on HBO. They have a scene in which the mafia is contacted to beat up a guy so he will give a get to his wife. And that's not really fiction. Yeah, the story was fiction, but it has happened. And there are cases even till today where there's some rabbis who have gotten into that sort of thing. It's not a very pleasant thing. And it's not, now, there are other things that are also done. Now, for example, in the conservative Ketubah that many use, there is what is known as the Lieberman clause. And the Lieberman clause essentially says that if either party refuses to give or accept a get, the rabbinical court is empowered to issue a get on behalf of the husband. And if he refuses to give the get, they can turn to the civil courts and seek damages. The Orthodox also have one like that, but there they have a contractual obligation that every day that the man refuses to give his wife a get, or every day she refuses to accept a get, there's a certain financial penalty that they agree to before the wedding that will transpire. All of these are means and methods trying to protect the Jewish woman who otherwise would have difficulties. So that's in a nutshell what's involved today in the Jewish world in terms of gittin, of issuing gets.
Rabbi Berman, sorry, can I ask you a question?
Yes, of course.
With regards to the get. So, like we have right now, the tradition, like the regular registration, right, for the marriage, which is like just.
Okay, that's a civil. Now that's all civil.
Just what I was wondering, like, so if you have a civil marriage and you have like a Jewish marriage, right, like with a guild. So let's say that the people like nowadays, like how.
Okay.
Like if one person doesn't want to, but you can still get divorced, right?
Yeah. All right. Let me go. There are two different issues. There's civil law, and there's religious law. Under civil law, let's say Ontario's got a real good system on that. Yes, you can get a divorce without the religious divorce, but there is also a law in the books in Ontario that if either party prevents the other party from getting remarried as a result of religious issues, there's certain ways that the court can enforce that the recalcitrant individual to stop their recalcitrance. So yes, you can, there are different ways, different things can happen. Ideally, if you're going to get married Jewishly, you have to have a civil license. The rabbi, the priest, whoever performs the religious ceremony also performs the civil ceremony by our system here. If God forbid you break up the marriage, you get a get, you give a get, and you have a civil divorce, everybody's happy, as it can be under the circumstances. Now, yeah, you can have a civil license, have a civil marriage without any religious marriage, have a civil divorce without any kind of religious divorce. And that is usually accepted as, at least post facto, if nothing else, if two Jews did that. Two Jews did not get married with a rabbi, and they had a civil divorce. If possible, we try to have the husband give a get nonetheless. If not, then because generally speaking, we'll recognize that there was no religious marriage. Now, you can also have a religious marriage, a civil marriage, get divorced civilly and never get a religious divorce. If you want to get married in a traditional synagogue, you can't do that without the get. Some people do that. Some people will turn to the Reform. The Reform don't necessarily insist upon a get. So those are all the things that are out there, Christina. There's the right
Rabbi
way
Berman,
and the wrong way.
Is it true that if an aguna doesn't get a get and has children, that those children are mamzerim?
Yes, if indeed you can't find a way around it. Now, the Orthodox world.
Sorry, what a what?
Okay. In English, we talk about bastards. That's not the correct term. In Jewish law, it states that if a woman has a child by if she's married, and the father of the child is anyone but her duly married husband, the child has the status of a mamzer. And a mamzer can only marry another mamzer. They cannot marry a Jew who's not a mamzer. It's a very terrible price to pay. Now, also, again, this is an area where we're told in the Talmud, and the ideal is you don't ask questions about this. You don't try, you try to avoid finding out that somebody is a mamzer. However, in the Orthodox world today, they're acting like mamzers in the sense that they do investigate sometimes and create all kinds of hurdles for people that they shouldn't. There are cases where, now, for example, remember I said that we have this idea of the hafka'at kiddushin, the annulment of the marriage. That has been suggested that if a woman had been married Jewishly, and then didn't have a get, got pregnant, had a child, that the first husband, original husband, could have a get issued to her, annul the get after it leaves the door, and then marriage will be automatically annulled from the beginning, the original marriage, so the children are not mamzerim. I know it's a little complicated, but that has been done on a couple of cases. Or there are all kinds of things that are done to try and see any way around it to make sure that they're not, but that's reality. Okay.
So, and how does this guilt look like? Is it like a piece of paper or?
It's not guilt, it's get. Usually
Get.
spelled G-E-T. It's usually heavy paper. The people who are involved with it see it for the time that it's taking place. But the get itself, the document itself, stays with the court or with the scribe who writes it. And instead, another piece of paper is called a patur, permission to get married again, is issued. And that's what the man or the woman has in their hand, possession. Okay. It's a very technical document. It has to have written a certain number of lines, and letters have to be, lines have to start with certain letters and things. It's very complicated intentionally to make it slower to take place so it doesn't just happen right, willy-nilly, as they say. Okay. Any other questions? You should all know from marriages, you should never know from divorces. All right. Okay. We will not meet next week. I am going, originally we thought it might, but I have got a schedule to get my vaccine at around 5:40. Yes.
Congrats.
Yeah. I was too young and too old until this week. So now you know how old I am. But that's at 5:40 somewhere up in, I don't know, up north here, somewhere northern Vaughan. And I don't know if timing and everything, if it work out to have the class. So, I said, I sent out the sheet, the updated information for the class. And so in 2 weeks, we will talk about the end of life and issues that dealing with the end of life and burial and things like that. Okay. Enjoy
Rabbi,
Passover Seder.
Rabbi, quick question for you actually about Pesach.
Yeah.
So the reason we can't have like bread and stuff is because it takes time to leaven the bread. And
well, it's the definition is 18 minutes of water being in contact with it.
Correct. So my question is, if you can't have bread because it takes so long for it to rise, why then is there glasses of wine drank when it takes time to ferment alcohol?
Well, the first is a good question. It has nothing to do with time per se. It has to do with fermentation. The correct question is, how can we ferment wine then? Would be the question to ask. I don't have a complete answer to that, except to say it's possible that wine was regarded differently. And the fermentation is only the fermentation that takes place on the 5 grains: wheat, barley, oats, spelt, and rye. But it is certainly a legitimate question. And maybe the fact of the matter is, it's possible that the ancient world, the rabbis didn't know that it was actually yeast that was on the wine, on the grapes, that caused the fermentation to take place. Be that as it may, it is only an issue in regards to grain, not to issue to fruit. So, for example, if you wanted to make hard apple cider, you can have hard apple cider. You can have vodka. You cannot have grain-based alcohol. But obviously the other alcohols are really a result of the same kind of chemical reaction going on, fermentation. I'm not really answering, I'm just explaining.
So then I suppose the next logical question would be, why, if it's just 5 grains, like where does kitnio and legumes fall in then?
All right. Well, that, first of all, Sephardim don't hold by it. Ashkenazim ruled it out. There are many different attempts to explain it. Some explain it is that it's these things were too much like the grains, and people might get confused using one flour versus the other flour. Some suggest that they were stored together, and the farmers, when they brought it in, they might get them mixed up together, and you would find it. For example, you can, if you buy rice, the Sephardim who eat rice on Pesach, they go through making sure there's no wheat kernels that got mixed in by accident. If you go to a store where they have, bins with wheat in it, and bins with corn in it, and bins with rice in them, people don't always carefully use the right scoop, and stuff can get mixed in together. So the concern was either people would get confused because they would think you could use regular bread, a regular flour, because you were using the legume kitniot flour, or it was because there's a fear they might get mixed in together in some way, and that's the basis for it. Like I said, when we talked about a few weeks ago, there are those in the conservative movement who permit use of legumes to the kitniot. There are those who do not. And so you talk to your rabbi as to guidance for that. Okay? Any other questions?
Yeah, I had a question with regard to the divorce, right? So you were saying that conservative, right, and Orthodox, like women cannot, how do you say that? Associate the divorce.
They can't initiate it.
Initiate.
Yeah.
Yes.
The husband has to be the one who, quote, gives the get. If he's uncooperative, it creates problems. That's why we have some of these solutions over the course of the ages. Unfortunately, today we can't beat a guy to make him do it. But in some circumstances, he can be thrown into jail, or he can be fined, and things like that. I do know that the conservative movement, if there is absolute non-cooperation by the husband, that they will issue a hafkat kiddushin, an annulment of the marriage.
So women basically still can say that, like, I want to divorce you.
You can say, I want, in conservative traditional circles, you can say, I want a divorce, but the Beit Din has to have permission from the husband for the divorce to be written.
Question then on that. Why does then the Orthodox Beit Din issue like serum after serum after serum and nothing happens? Or serum after serum?
I'm sorry, I did not quite understand the question. Issue what?
Like a seruv?
Oh, because it depends on the community and what kind of backing they have to behind the seruv. If we let's take Toronto. What kind of enforcement can the local Beit Din have to their order? That's what a seruv means. It means a court order to appear before the Beit Din and respond to them properly. Now in Israel,
but then is it acceptable to leave the woman as an agana?
Well, that's why there are different ways why the conservative movement, if there's no other choice, will do the hafkat kiddushin. That's why some Orthodox rabbis have suggested a similar practice, but the bulk of the Orthodox world won't accept it. And like I say, they try to find other ways to alleviate the situation if they can. There was a very famous case, for example, in Israel. It's not the same thing, but there was a case of mamzei rut. And Rabbi Goren, who was at that time, he wasn't yet the chief rabbi, but he eventually became the chief rabbi of Israel. he eventually, what he did, he found a way to invalidate the woman's first marriage, claiming the husband was not converted properly to Judaism. Therefore, there was never a marriage. Therefore, the children were not mamzerim. But in Israel, they can have the man thrown into jail. They don't do it often enough. That is true. In the way things exist in today's world, if your synagogue's putting pressure on you, you can't have aliyot to the Torah, nobody will deal with you. So you go to a different synagogue. We don't have the communal enforcement power that used to exist, for better and for worse. And since it's a law of the Torah, it's very hard to find, you can't just ignore it. You have to find, and in the Orthodox world, especially if you touch anything that has a law of the Torah aspect to it, they're very, very hesitant to do anything that might be questionable. So I was saying, in the Orthodox world today, the modern Orthodox do have the bride and groom sign a prenuptial agreement. But the right wing or the Haredim won't accept it. They don't approve of it because you're getting the secular courts involved.
Yeah, those are good actually organizations. I've seen them in the States.
Yeah, but that you can do it. You can do it. Some of my colleagues here do it. I know that a lot of the modern Orthodox rabbis use that documentation that should prove amenable to resolve the problem when time comes, if it comes to that. But it also becomes an issue of church and state. How much leeway do you have in the particular communities in which you live, and religious laws and religious practices and modern democratic ideals and all of those things, they get all jumbled together and creates its issues. Okay. All right, I know, Hein, you're going to look at the, later on. So anyway, I'm going to post this video as soon as I can. It may not be ready tonight, but it should be ready by tomorrow. Okay, I'll say good night to everybody. Have a good week. Have a good Yantav, and I'll see you after Pesach.